third chapter, his rule in Egypt. Dr. Leonhard Schmidt, PhD, LLD, FRSE, says in his work on ancient Egyptian history that these Hyksos or shepherd kings were Semite people, white, of course, and they comprised the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties, which covered 511 years. Now, during this period, Jacob and his 12 sons and their families moved from Canaan to Egypt. And other Semite or whites from Asia did likewise because the white man had begun to rule Egypt. At the 18th dynasty, however, fortune turned against the white rulers of Egypt, and the black men of the Negroes regained possession of their country and banished the whites from their land except the Jews whom they held as slaves. They reorganized the kingdom with their own blood, the blood of the Negro. Hamas was the first king after the whites were driven out. And his wife was Neferuari, the Ethiopian princess greatly celebrated for her dusky charms, her wealth, and her accomplishments. The beginning of this reorganization of a period is recorded in the first chapter of the book of Exodus, which shows that at the beginning of the slavery of the Jews, God told Abraham that his people would be held in bondage in Egypt for 400 years. Genesis 15, chapter 13, verse. Those 400 years marked the period of Egypt's most rapid and substantial progress, as Dr. Schmitz says in writing on ancient Egyptian history, whose years were the most brilliant in Egypt's record and the period at which her art reached its highest point. It is but reasonable to suppose this to have been so, for the shepherd or white kings had destroyed all the former brilliancy of Egypt and did not because they could not do anything to replace or imitate its grandeur or beauty. The black people, when they regained possession of their kingdom and again began to rule, made slaves of the Jews and compelled them to do all the heavy, dirty, unskilled labor, such as carrying bricks and mortar and working in the field. Exodus 1st chapter 13th and 14th verses. While the Egyptians turned their attention to science and art and reorganizing and drilling their armies so as to be able to protect their country against all nations. As Dr. Schmidt says, the eastern boundaries of Egypt were unfriendly to the Egyptians or black people because they had expelled the shepherd or white kings from their land. Now, when the Egyptians had obtained in that age to the highest degree of intelligence and wisdom and were possessed of the greatest human power, God deemed it wise to make his own infinite wisdom and power felt over that of human wisdom and power by using Moses as an instrument to knock at the door of the Egyptian government and ask for the release of the enslaved Jews. Moses did not appear in Egypt by any human authority or power, but by the authority and the power of God. For it would have been useless for not only Moses, but for any nation or number of nations to approach Egypt with hostile intentions without God, because Egypt, with her wisdom and power, had the world at her mercy. There it required God with his immeasurable wisdom and power to overcome the wisdom and power of these black Egyptians. This evidence of God's power was displayed to the Pharaoh Meneptah, who is generally conceded to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, by his God's instruments, Moses and Aaron, who were to appear before the Pharaoh and cast down their gods, which turned to serpents. Exodus 7th chapter 10th verse. When they had cast down their rods before Pharaoh and they turned to serpents. Pharaoh called the wise men or magicians of Egypt with their enchantments, and they cast down their rods, which also became serpents. Exodus 7th, chapter 11th and 12th verses. This was the performance of two miracles, one by God's power and one by human power. Divine with God, though only for an instance of time, is what no white man has had the power to do since his creation. But however, God, in order to demonstrate his supreme power, caused the serpents transformed from the rods of Moses and Aaron to swallow the serpents transformed from the rods of Pharaoh's or Egypt's wise men, Exodus 7-12. This rod and serpent incident was the beginning of a series of plague miracles. Read the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th chapters of Exodus, which wrecked the Egyptians of black man's kingdom and also destroyed the great power which had over all other nations and released the Jews from slavery. The black man's power as the first power among the nations had now begun to decay. And as the black race began to die as a power among nations, the white race began to rise to where it had never been before. But this was 2,500 years after the black man had worked out all the problems of civilization. In reading Revelation 13th chapter, 11th verse of St. John the Divine, I am very much impressed by the description of one of his revelations which God unfolded to him and which he describes as follows. I behold another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like lambs, and he spake as a dragon. Now, to my mind, the foregoing vision of St. John the Divine was this very country, the United States of America, revealed to him ages ago before this country was discovered and named the two horns. I interpret to be the two great political parties that have done so much to corrupt this government and misrule its people from their infancy to the present day. Again, the American government spake like a dragon when it permitted slavery to exist, especially when its constitution says that all men were born free and equal. Now, concerning the creating and enthralling of nations that rise and fall, that is the will and the work of God. 75th Psalms, 6th and 7th verses. Jeremiah 27th and 5th verses. Daniel 2nd chapter 21st verse. Daniel 4th chapter 17th verse. So since it is true that the black man is the father of civilization, it is just as true that the white man is now at the helm. And the big I am of the civilized world. But the fact remains that he took his civilization, his position, after the black man had created it and passed from the stage of action, just as a white man must do at God's own appointed time, to make room for some other race, probably the yellow race, Chinese or Japanese. David the psalmist said, Egypt was the land of the black man, Ham, not Shem, the white man. And he further said that the tabernacles, which were the houses and dwellings from the lowest to the king's palaces, were Ham's, and not Shem's, the white man. Psalms 106th chapter, 22nd verse, 105th chapter, 23rd to 27th verse, 78th chapter, 51st verse. It is easy to understand why the Negro or black man is not identified with his Egyptian brother. That reason is seldom honestly and earnestly sought for. The reason is that the historians, with a very few exceptions, write from a prejudiced standpoint, together with the fact that they do not give credit to the Old Testament, if indeed they study it at all, especially that part of it which is the most ancient and beyond all shadow of a doubt the first and only true account of the origin of mankind. It is easy to understand. It is impossible for God to forget that the black man in his land, Egypt, was the cradle of rescue that rocked and nursed the Son of God in his first 2 years of life, when Herod's decree to destroy all children under 2 years of age was issued. It was known that the decree was issued for the express and only purpose of destroying the infant Christ. But God chose Egypt, the black man's land, as a haven of rest and safety during the life of the displeased and would-be infant murderer Herod, Matthew 2nd chapter. This might be the origin of that old saying, blood is thicker than water. But Jesus is going into Egypt, went among black women and men who were the founders of the tribe from which he sprang. When God, in his infinite wisdom, his great love, justice, and mercy, and at his own appointed time, summons mankind to take his rightful place in the wavering human line, to be rewarded for their smallest of virtues and proportions, as he, for the greatest virtues, will say to the black man who will be found heading the line, well done, thou good and faithful black servant, thou, my instrument, the father of civilization. The end. Comments. I beg to say, after hearing Elder Webb on the subject that the blood of the Negro coursed through the veins of Jesus and Solomon, I am frank to say I have seldom, if ever, enjoyed such an intellectual treat. The position he assumed as the subject of his lecture touching the Hamite blood and race is difficult and requires a practical knowledge of biblical and historical lore. But I am pleased to say that he not only shows himself an expert, but the master of the situation, and I commend him to the ministry and churches of our race of every denomination truly. Bishop H.M. Turner. Comment from one of the leading papers of the writer's home. The evidence submitted by Elder Webb tending to prove that the Savior of mankind was a black man seems to be sufficient to put those who oppose the proposition upon their proof. Now that the claim of evidence presented by Mr. Webb appears so complete, it is strange that none of the delvers in the biblical records have not advanced the sensational proposition before. Not only was Christ a Negro, but it seems that Solomon, who has been held up through all of the ages as the personification of wisdom, had Ethiopian blood in his veins also. Seattle Daily Times. Now, this is an excerpt that's put in this book. It's by Henry O. Tanner, the world famous Afro-American artist. Henry O. Tanner is the world famous Afro-American artist. He is the oldest son of Bishop Tanner of the AME Church. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but was trained in the public schools of Philadelphia, to which place his parents moved soon after his birth. His first steps in his life work were taken in the art schools of Philadelphia, from which training he went to Paris, where his genius developed and flowered in the studies of Benjamin, Constant, and Julian. In 1895, his Sabbat Maker was shown in the Salon exhibit and received friendly treatment from the French critics. Frenchmen, as a rule, are not too favorably inclined to the works of foreigners, and their appreciation of Tanner is truly significant of the real value this work, a merit which puts it beyond the limitations of race and country. In 1896, he exhibited Daniel in the Lion's Den, the first of a line of religious works with which his fame has been since connected. This picture received honorable mention from the French jury and was bought by the Pennsylvania Academy. Mr. Tanner's picture, The Two Disciples at the Tomb, was purchased by the Chicago Art Institute for $1,600. In memory of Paul Laurence Dunbar, famous African American poet, titled The Colored Soldiers, from Dunbar's Lyrics of Lowly Life. If the muse were mine to tempt it, and my feeble voice was strong, If my tongue were trained to measures, I would sing a stirring song. I would sing a song of heroic, of those noble sons of Ham, of the gallant colored soldiers who fought for Uncle Sam. In the early days, you scorned them, and with many a flip and flout, said these battles are the white man's, and the whites will fight them out. Up the hills you fought and faltered, in the vales you strove and bled, while your ears still heard the thunder of the foes that advance and tread. Then distress fell on the nation, and the flag was drooping low. Should the dust pollute your banner? No! The nation shouted no. So when war and savage triumph spread abroad his funeral pall, then you called the colored soldiers, and they answered to your call. And like hounds unleashed and eager for the lifeblood of the prey, sprang they forth and bore them bravely in the thickest of the fray. And wherever the fight was hottest, where the bullets fastest fell, there they pressed, unblenched and fearless, at the very mouth of hell. Below are written some of the comments on his poetry and prose. Dr. Adams, editor of the Advance, says Dunbar was a genius bound in ebony. Former President Theodore Roosevelt said, I was a great admirer of his poetry and his prose.